In our headlines on this Friday, February 21st, here in South Korea. The final hearing of the impeachment trial to decide on the political fate of President Yoon Suk-yeol will take place next Tuesday, after which a verdict by the Constitutional Court is expected by mid-March. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Deputy Trade Minister Park Jong-won formally requests an exemption from Trump tariffs, citing the presence of the free trade agreement between South Korea and the U.S. And the U.S. cancels a scheduled joint press conference between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg following their talks in Kyiv about ending Russian aggression. President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment trial will come to a close next Tuesday with the 11th hearing that will see the president and the parliamentary impeachment panel sharing their final remarks. Our Oh Soo-young reports.
President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment trial will conclude next Tuesday with his final statement at the Constitutional Court. The court announced Thursday at Yoon's 10th trial hearing that the next and final session would be held on February 25th, some 74 days after the impeachment vote passed at the National Assembly. The bench will review remaining evidence before the National Assembly's legal team and the president's lawyers each make their closing arguments. Then the Assembly's panel co-chair Chung Chung-rae and President Yoon will deliver their final remarks. The court on Thursday held the last round of witness examinations.
The questions focused on whether the president went through proper cabinet procedures before declaring martial law and whether he'd ordered arrests of key politicians and judicial figures.
First up was Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, who said there had been anomalies in procedure and substance compared to a standard cabinet meeting. He said the defence minister had not consulted him before recommending martial law to the president, as required by the constitution, and said no minutes were taken. Han stopped short of judging whether or not a legitimate cabinet meeting took place, saying that should be determined through investigative and judicial procedures. Former National Intelligence Service Deputy Director Hong Jang-won, who was a witness earlier this month, returned for further questioning by Yoon's legal team. Hong previously testified that he'd made note of 14 to 16 figures to arrest under martial law, claiming that he'd written it in the night outside the residence of his boss, Director Cho Tae-yong. He received the names from Defense Counterintelligence Commander Yo In-young, who Hong phoned as the president had told him to help out the commander. But Hong changed his words on Thursday, saying he had been in his office after all. His boss told the court last week that Hong had lied about his whereabouts, citing CCTV footage. As Hong and Yoon's lawyers clashed over the veracity of his note, which was reproduced and altered various times, the president spoke out, saying the debate misses the point. He said he'd called Hong to encourage him to work with Yoon hunting down spies, without mentioning martial law. He pointed out that Hong was the one who called the commander, made notes, and then held on to them until he was dismissed from the NIS. National Police Agency Chief Cho Ji-ho also stood witness after 2 absences due to illness. He refused to answer most questions due to his own criminal case, but said he testified truthfully to prosecutors. Cho had said Yoon called him 6 times on December 3rd and told him to arrest lawmakers. Based on past presidential impeachment trials, a verdict is likely to be reached within 2 weeks around March 11th. Former President Park Geun-hye's impeachment was upheld in 11 days, while former President Roh Moo-hyun's was dismissed in 14 days. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In a separate development, the National Police Agency has booked President Yoon Suk-yeol on charges of obstructing the execution of an arrest warrant. Our Shin Ha-young explains.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has been booked by the NPA for allegedly using the Presidential Security Service to block investigators' attempts to detain him last month over his declaration of martial law. According to police on Friday, Yoon has been booked on charges of special obstruction of public duty. However, as a sitting president, he cannot be criminally prosecuted. The Special Police Investigation Unit looking into the martial law declaration has reportedly obtained text messages between Yoon and PSS Deputy Chief Kim Sung-hoon regarding efforts to block the execution of the warrant to detain him. It was confirmed that they exchanged messages through the US-based messaging app Signal on January 3rd during the first attempt to serve the warrant. 4 days later, they exchanged messages again with Yoon ordering the security team to intervene if a second attempt was made. Kim relayed the order to his staff, but they refused to comply, leading to Yoon's arrest on January 15th. The police did not disclose the details of the messages. Meanwhile, the Special Investigation Unit announced on Friday that they had transferred the case of 6 military officials, including Won Chun-hee, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, to the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials. The officials were booked on charges of insurrection. The CIO launched a search and seizure procedure the same day at Won's house and office. It is investigating allegations that Won met with former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun and former commander of the Defense Intelligence Command Moon Sang-ho the day before Yoon's martial law declaration to discuss its imposition. 신하영, Arirang News.
South Korea is seeking an exemption from the Trump administration's tariff campaign, given the presence of the free trade agreement between the two countries. According to the Trade Ministry here on this Friday, Deputy Trade Minister Park Jong-won formally made a request to this end during talks in Washington this week with officials from the White House, the Commerce Department, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He also reportedly called for mutually beneficial trade endeavors while underscoring the substantial investment in the U.S. made by Korean companies in recent times. Korea's trade watchdog has recommended anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese steel plate imports following an investigation into their impact on the domestic market. Our Lee Seung-jae has details.
Back in July of last year, Hyundai Steel filed a complaint with the government against low-priced Chinese thick steel plates. 3 months later, the Korea Trade Commission launched an investigation into the case. The nation's trade watchdog on Thursday made a preliminary decision to impose anti-dumping tariffs on thick steel plates being imported from China after identifying possible damage to the domestic industry. In its latest recommendation, the KTC will ask the Ministry of Economy and Finance to impose an anti-dumping duty of between 27.91% and 38.02%. The final decision on the levies is expected to be announced 5 months from now. The latest recommendation by the KTC comes amid the Trump administration's decision to impose 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports starting next month. Economists say the higher tariff on steel and aluminum imports to the U.S. will lead to Chinese steel products being flooded into other regions, such as Europe and Southeast Asia, leading South Korean steelmakers to face tougher price competition. Experts also say the domestic steel industry has been hit hard due to oversupply from China and a slowdown in domestic demand. While the domestic demand for thick plates fell in 2023, the proportion of thick plates being imported from China has increased. Last year alone, Chinese imports accounted for 17% of all thick steel plate purchases in the country. The domestic thick plate market is estimated to be around 8 trillion won, or over $5.5 billion. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
On the local trade front, exports during the first 20 days of February surged on year on the back of global chip demand. According to the Korea Customs Service on this Friday, exports amounted to $35.3 billion during this period, up 16% on year. Semiconductor shipments overseas soared over 22%, while passenger vehicles and auto parts also jumped more than 40% and 9%, respectively. Given this latest performance, South Korea logged a trade surplus of $800 million. A scheduled joint press conference was cancelled following talks between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg at the request of the U.S. Our Chairman John covers this event and more.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S.-Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg met in Kyiv on Thursday and held what Zelenskyy called a productive meeting. Zelenskyy shared on social media that they had a detailed conversation about the battlefield situation, the return of Ukrainian prisoners of war, and effective security guarantees, emphasizing the importance of U.S.-Ukraine relations. However, the meeting did not result in significant breakthroughs in securing U.S. support, as evidenced by the cancellation of a planned joint press conference at the request of the U.S. What was supposed to be a media event turned into a brief photo opportunity without remarks or questions. Kellogg's visit to Kyiv came amid escalating tensions between U.S. President Donald Trump and Zelenskyy. On Wednesday, Ukraine rejected U.S. demands for $500 billion in minerals as repayment for wartime aid, citing inadequate support from Washington and a lack of security guarantees. Trump's frustration with Zelenskyy is apparent, as he believes Zelenskyy has not taken advantage of the opportunities presented.
Look, President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelenskyy. The fact that that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will get to that point, and I hope so very quickly.
Additionally, the U.S. is resisting putting the blame on Russia for the war by opposing the inclusion of Russian aggression in a G7 joint statement marking the war's third anniversary. This follows Trump's comments blaming Ukraine for the war and calling Zelenskyy a dictator without elections. He has also proposed inviting Russia back to the G7. Next week, Trump is set to meet with the leaders of France and the UK to discuss strategies for ending the war in Ukraine and post-war planning. European nations have so far been left without a clear role in the peace talks. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, on the margins of the G20 foreign ministers meeting in South Africa, Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol sat down separately with his British and Australian counterparts. Now, on the agenda were diverse global matters, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine and North Korea's illicit military support. Top diplomats are gathered in Johannesburg for the first G20 ministerial meeting of the year, centered around the theme of solidarity, equality, sustainability. Now, notably, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced his absence from the meeting, finding fault with the theme of the latest talks for resembling diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives, which the Trump administration reportedly opposes. In Korea, it's not the cherry on top, it's the strawberry. And advances in farming technology here have made it possible for us to indulge in them all year round, as their popularity also takes them from our tables to those beyond borders. Our Song Yoo-jin has this tasty tale.
From cakes and tarts to canapes and salads and even sandwiches, strawberries dominate bakeries and restaurants across Korea this time of year. But their appeal isn't just local. While Southeast Asia has long been a key market, Korean strawberries are now expanding into new regions. Compared to 2021, exports to the Middle East jumped 40 times last year, while U.S. exports increased threefold.
Until the early 2000s, Japanese strawberries dominated exports to Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. But in 2002, Korea developed the Maehang variety, which has firmer flesh, a longer shelf life, and a sweeter taste, ideal for export. That was the turning point.
It all started here.
So here, the Strawberry Research Institute in Nonsan City, Chungcheongnam-do Province, is where Korea's signature strawberry varieties like this are developed. So far, researchers here have cultivated over a dozen unique varieties.
This institute introduced the internationally popular Maehang and then Seolhyang in 2005, which holds an 80% share of the domestic market. It's also home to trending varieties like Kingsberry, as large as a fist, and Vitaberry, known for its high vitamin content. Developing new strains is a rigorous process, typically taking 5 to 7 years.
We do it through selective breeding with a focus on taste and yield. The flavor must stand out to attract consumers, and a high-yield variety ensures stable supply.
This commitment has shaped the iconic flavor of Korean strawberries.
Korean strawberries offer a unique sweet-tart balance, which is different to many tropical fruits, for example. They also have a juicy texture and softer bite, which makes them especially popular among international consumers.
But the journey doesn't stop here, with researchers working to develop the breakthrough variety.
We're developing new varieties with improved durability for the sake of distribution. At the same time, as climate conditions change, we're also focusing on breeding disease-resistant strawberries.
It's a success story that's getting sweeter. And it looks like the best is yet to come. 송유진, 아리랑 뉴스, 논산.
And on the subject of success stories, a group of granny rappers in a remote Korean county is garnering quite a bit of attention for proving it's never too late to learn. Our Park Gonu met up with them.
A community center in a small rural village of around 100 residents. This is where Suni and the Seven Princesses, a hip-hop group of women with an average age of 85, was formed 2 years ago. Overhearing joyful voices, I peeked inside.
안녕하세요. 뭐 하고 계셨어요?
한글 공부하고 있었어요. Their life stories, woven into their lyrics, have brought fresh energy thanks to their regular Korean classes.
When I was young, I had to walk several kilometers to school because of the war, so I couldn't study. But learning Korean has opened my eyes.
They use fun methods like singing traditional Korean songs to improve. After class, they quickly transformed, donning hip-hop gear and rapping like pros, a striking contrast to their Korean lessons.
The granny rappers show us that it's never too late to challenge yourself and speak your truth through your honest lyrics. Inspired by them, today I decided to try rapping. Together with the grannies, we send our message to our viewers. 우린 너무 행복해요. 여러분도 행복하세요. Everybody happy.
This group has offered hope and inspiration in South Korea, which turned into a super-age society last year with over 20% of the population aged 65 or older. Their success has even led to the creation of other elderly hip-hop groups. And they're boosting the local economy with merchandise featuring their faces, symbolizing the region. Their influence stretches beyond the local communities, performing at venues nationwide, and even spreading globally. A documentary about them, directed by a Polish filmmaker, is set to be released later this year. The filmmaker shared her inspiration behind the project.
The project is to show to the other people that we are limitless, that we can change our lives no matter in which age we are currently in. We shouldn't have any excuses for anything, right? She started the rapping band in that age, so that's really impressive.
As the filmmaker hopes, Suni and the Seven Princesses will continue spreading their powerful message.
It's incredible we've come this far. If we can do it at this age, young people can too.
Emphasizing that she's already very happy, she said her only wish is for her and the members to stay healthy. 박건우, 아리랑 뉴스, 7곡.
This is The World Now, bringing you the latest stories from around the globe. In Israel, 3 buses exploded in Bat Yam just south of Tel Aviv on Thursday in what authorities are investigating as coordinated terror attacks. No casualties have been reported. The explosions on 3 empty buses parked approximately 500 meters apart happened within minutes of each other and are believed to have been caused by makeshift explosive devices equipped with timers. 2 bombs were discovered on other buses but were defused by police. A note was found with one of the unexploded devices, referencing revenge from Tulkarem, alluding to a recent Israeli military operation in the West Bank. In response to the incident, a temporary halt to all public transportation nationwide has been ordered to facilitate thorough investigations. Israel's internal security agency has taken over the investigation, and a search is underway for suspects. Meanwhile, Israel has received the bodies of what Hamas says are 4 hostages, including a mother and her 2 young children. But Israel says one of the bodies is of someone else. On Thursday, Hamas returned the remains of what were claimed to be Shiri Bibas, aged 32, and her 4-year-old and 9-month-old sons, along with Oded Lifshitz, an 84-year-old journalist. However, the Israel Defense Forces says that one of the sets of remains was not that of Shiri Bibas. The handover in Khan Yunis, Gaza, was marked by a provocative display by Palestinians, with coffins covered with offensive imagery and anti-Israel slogans. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the scene, calling Hamas monsters for their actions. In Tel Aviv's Hostages Square, thousands gathered to mourn the dead hostages who were abducted during the October 2023 attacks. U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said on Thursday during a press conference at the White House that all NATO members should allocate at least 2% of their gross domestic product to defense spending, a standard set in 2014. The call to action comes ahead of the NATO summit slated for June, where defense budgets are expected to be a central topic of discussion. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that NATO member states should spend 5% of their GDP beyond the 2% guideline. Currently, 18 of NATO's 32 member countries meet or exceed the 2% GDP defense spending benchmark. However, several nations, including Canada, have yet to reach this target. In the United Kingdom, London Fashion Week Autumn-Winter 2025 has kicked off. The event, which runs until February 24th, features a mix of traditional runway shows and digital presentations encompassing both established and emerging designers. This season, the British Fashion Council has introduced sustainability requirements for brands, emphasizing the industry's commitment to environmental responsibility. Participants include Harris Reed, who opened the week with a showcase, while Burberry is set to close the event on Monday evening. A pop-up shop to commercially support designers will also run from February 22nd to 24th. Choi Ji-hee, Arirang News.
Ahead of the weekend, the winter cold continues nationwide, with cold wave warnings and advisories still in place. It was very cold this morning everywhere. The wind chill made it feel like it was below zero even during the day all over the country. It will stay cold this whole weekend. With freezing conditions, the air stays dry. In the East Coast areas where a dry weather warning is in effect, the wildfire crisis warning level was raised to caution level. Since gusty winds are blowing as well, please take extra precautions not to cause any wildfires. Tomorrow morning will start off at below 0 degrees nationwide, with Seoul at -7 degrees Celsius, Gwangju and Busan at -3 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 2 degrees in Seoul, 4 degrees in Daejeon. The weather will be as cold as today until the weekend, then ease off a bit starting from early next week. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session, and today we touch upon a host of social issues here that made international headlines.
How to survive in Korea. Cafes. Step 1. Find a seat. Before ordering, find a seat. Laptop ID, smartphone, jacket, whatever that can mark your territory. But no bites. It's a little too big. Step 2. Pick up. We do not ask or call your name. We call out, B69 고객님. The buzzer will vibrate when your order is ready at the counter. Wait, got your straw? Keep the top of the wrapper on. Doing this is more hygienic. Step 3. Cafe etiquette. If you need to use your laptop, find a seat next to a socket. No extra charge for using electricity. But if you're staying over 3 hours, how about ordering another drink or dessert? Step 4. Last bite standing. There's a mysterious custom in Korea. The last bite standing. When there's about 1 bite left of that cake, nobody will go for it. You might be tempted, but don't be hasty. Right before you get up, take the last piece, saying that you simply can't waste food, or just leave it. It will save a few calories. Did you survive at the cafe? Did someone behind the counter catch your eye? Go for the same drink every single day.
오늘도 아이스 말차 라떼 드실 거죠?
You might make an impression.
Capturing your day starts at New Day at Arirang.
A global conversation through the unique lens of millennials and Gen Zs. News Generation.
From politics to culture, delivering news from home and abroad. The Daily Report. A profound analysis of Korea by members of the media. Press Perspective.
A distinct perspective and a broader view. News Center.
A compelling discussion spotlighting domestic and international affairs within the frame.
Opening new vistas through a window of truth, connecting Korea and the world. Your pick, Arirang News.
A British daily has reignited fears about a potential demographic crisis in Korea's second largest city, Busan, as its youth continue to depart from their hometown. We cover this and more in Press Perspective today. Hello, welcome to Press Perspective. It's Friday, February 21st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Right, it's time for our weekly coverage of the various stories about Korea that made international headlines in recent times. For this, I have Kelly Kasulisto with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the pundit's take on the media coverage today. Colin, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here, Sunny.
Right, Kelly, as I mentioned at the start, a British daily recently published a piece about the demographic decline in Korea's second largest city, Busan. Now, Korea's plunging population, if you will, has been making international headlines for quite a while now. I'm assuming you've also covered this concerning trend.
Yeah, it's one of the recurrent themes, I think, as a reporter here in South Korea. In my 8 years in this country, that is the topic that you kind of find a new way into again and again, usually through government proposals on ways to fix it that ultimately are not really that successful, because it is a chronic systemic issue that we're actually starting to worry about in other parts of the world as well, including the United States. You know, with Busan, I was actually kind of surprised. I didn't see, whenever I go to Busan, I didn't see on the street like a very big difference from what I see in Seoul. But for people who are not in Korea, I'll describe what, generally speaking, I've noticed. Again, I mentioned I've been here 8 years. You start to normalize the aging population when you live here, and you lose sense of how it really affects daily life. Last year, I went to Europe and I went to Turkey for a little bit, and I remember being suddenly hit with this feeling that I'm old, and I saw, you know, teenagers, young people in their early 20s, children out playing in the street in all these megacities that are smaller than Seoul. And it occurred to me that me as a 30 or 31-year-old, I'm not actually that young, but it feels that way because I live in a country where the median age is 45, which is extremely high on a global scale. I think the US, it's more like 35. And the other thing I thought about at that time was, actually, I go days at a time without seeing any children. And if I do, I see maybe one or two. So you kind of lose a sense when you're talking about like a 0.79 children per woman birth rate. It's really hard to kind of qualify that in day-to-day life. So I just want to mention that as, like, you really do see the difference. Schools are closing down. Universities are worried about no longer having students in the future. The military has expressed on numerous occasions that they're having staffing troubles because they don't have enough young men to conscript into service. And there's real concerns that that could be an issue with border security given the North Korea problem. And so it's a really big issue. And with Busan, I think it's been in the headlines mostly because the stat is that the population is expected to decrease by about 33% between 2020 and 2050. For Seoul, it's about 21%. I also read that more than half of Busan's population at this point is over 50. Again, that's pretty shocking, but with Seoul, the median age is already 45, or with the country nationally. And, you know, just to dive into this one last factoid is that 80% of the country's top earners live in Seoul, and about 60% of jobs, period, not just good jobs, desirable jobs, but jobs at all, exist within Seoul. So you're really seeing this aging population in Korea as a whole, as well as this kind of anchoring to the capital city up north.
Right, and staying with that, Colin, concerns have been raised about urban centralization here in capital Seoul being especially severe. What has been your experience living here?
Yes, to draw some obvious context, the more centralized Seoul is, the more hollowed out everywhere else is, as Kelly talks about in Busan. I have a professor friend in Busan who tells me, you have no idea how bad it is. We're down to classes with one student, and that student is on his phone. So if you could imagine. And I haven't gone down there in a while. I like to travel regionally in Korea, but you do notice how empty certain places are and how high the ambient age of the population is, if you will. And of course, you hear this as well. You hear Seoul's concentration or congestion, if you like, or the sheer urban agglomeration of Seoul being cast as a bad thing, sort of instinctively. But really, when someone comes to visit Seoul, much of what they appreciate is how concentrated it is how everywhere they want to go or need to go will probably be near them. You know, I always noticed this when I was first living in Korea. When you send an email in Korean, what do you always reference first? The weather, because people will probably be in the same city as you. They'll be under the same weather as you. Whereas in the US, it doesn't quite make sense. They could be across the country easily. They probably won't be in a place with the same weather. But in Korea, they'll probably be in Seoul. Now, there have been efforts to de-Seoulize for a long time. I mean, Daum, the web portal company, moved their headquarters to Jeju 20 years ago. And I think the jury's still out on whether that was a good move. But there's Sejong City, moving a lot of the federal or government, national bureaucracy, rather, to a city south of Seoul, which people don't really like living in, as I understand it, but it's gotten better over the years. What else has there been? There have been different pushes to sort of to build desirable places to live and work outside Seoul, such as Songdo as well in Incheon. The reclaimed land turned into this sort of, not quite forest of skyscrapers, but this urban construction designed to emulate the best parts, so-called, of different areas of the world, different urbanized areas of the world. And the most telling thing about Songdo, I think, is one time I went to get a tour back in the day when a lot of editors of magazines were asking me for articles about Songdo. You know, is this the future of the city, Songdo? So I had to go there over and over again. And I went one time, got the tour from the company that built the place. And I asked the guy giving me the tour, oh, where do you live? Do you live here in Songdo? He's like, no, I live in Gangnam. So they have shuttles going straight from Gangnam to Songdo. So it's not, if you can live someplace else, you probably don't live in Songdo. You probably do live in Seoul. And there's a good reason for that. There are some negative side effects, but as for the effects on Seoul itself, I mean, people like Seoul, they complain about Seoul, but they obviously like it. They don't leave. It's like, I published a book last year. I wrote about Seoul as being the city no one likes, but no one leaves. And many, many, many Koreans have asked me about that, saying, yeah, that's true, isn't it? And it's all because of how much is here, all together.
Right, and given this reality, Kelly, there are efforts, of course, to tackle the situation better by encouraging more people to live beyond the boundaries, so to speak, of Seoul. Such campaigns, if you will, to perhaps breathe fresh life into small rural communities, they're also evident across the world, I believe. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, well, first of all, on a personal note, my emo, my aunt here in Korea, is one of these people that was coaxed to move down south away from Seoul in Ganjin, which is kind of near Busan, through one of these programs that South Korea has proposed where, you know, they basically say you can live here for free or pay almost nothing, live in an old fixer-upper with a great view of the sea, and we'll have government programs that will teach you how to do fun things like farming, pottery. But, you know, she's like 65, and so she was reaching that point in her life where that sounded like a good retirement plan. And you know, that's good for something like population redistribution, but not necessarily if you're trying to get young people to come to, you know, your city or town. And essentially, as I mentioned before, it's really an issue of jobs. There was a really good article from 2023 in the World Economic Forum that kind of briefly touched on how various countries and municipalities are dealing with this. Japan and Italy are both countries that are known for having very aged populations like South Korea, and there have been some programs that have been kind of advertising free homes if you want to go live in a less populated part of these countries. From what I've read, and I haven't dug too deeply in this, there is a catch often. Sometimes if you're getting a home for free, you have to pay the back taxes that were not paid on it, or you get a home that is in complete disrepair, that is actually kind of a liability for the town if someone doesn't live in it, or maybe you don't actually own the home, but you're allowed to occupy it, and it's on you to fix it up. But if the person who owned the place wanted it back, they could take it back. So I have heard of programs like this. These exist in Korea as well. I read that Tokyo has offered, or Japan has offered, families $7,600 per child to leave the greater Tokyo area. I mean, I don't know, if someone were to come to me and say, I'll pay you $7,600 to have twice as long as a commute, it might not be worth it for me, but it's an attempt to address this issue. I've read that the state of Vermont in the U.S., which is kind of known for, you know, marijuana smoking and hikers and, you know, beautiful mountains and trees, that they've offered a grant for people who want to work remotely if they're able to, in order to rehabilitate the state. So there are programs out there. I don't know how successful they are, and ultimately I think a lot of the issue is just the distribution of jobs, which tend to be in very expensive urban areas. And also within South Korea, the resistance to remote work probably also has something to do with this. There's actually a backlash to remote working jobs happening in the U.S. right now as well. A lot of people are being called back into offices, or companies want to control what state you live in. It's just that you don't have to show up into an office. But I think a lot of this comes down to me, for instance, if I want to have a job within journalism that pays really well. I mean, Seoul, Tokyo, London, New York, Los Angeles, those are basically my options.
Right. Colin, all this being said, what do you propose perhaps to keep some of Korea's smaller remote communities on the map?
It's a tricky problem. I suspect much will depend on how well connected those places are to Seoul. So look at the KTX map. I think you can see where might thrive and where might not, or at least the ITX map. It doesn't have to be KTX. If it's just the Mugunghwa, I'm not sure. But it's important to be connected to the capital in a country like this. As you say when you asked me, this city that is, this country that is so capital-centric, more so than Japan, more so than England, more so than France, which is saying something. It's vital to be connected, because sooner or later you have to go to Seoul, no matter where you live in Korea. In the US, you don't have to go to New York. You don't have to go to Los Angeles. You can live a lifetime never going to either of those cities, or Washington, D.C., much more so, or San Francisco. But here, you're just going to have to go to Seoul sooner or later. And if you're one of these retirees who goes to the countryside, you'll probably need a form of medical care at some point you can't get in your province, let alone in your village. You'll have to go to Seoul. And so that connectivity, or being connected by the KTX or otherwise, is going to be important. One side effect of that, as seen in Japan, is you sort of run the risk of turning the whole country into the suburb of the capital. In Tokyo, I mean, there's the sense that a third of Japan is essentially a suburb or exurb of Tokyo. And the joke here, I mean, even in Korea now, Daegu, which is by no means a rural hamlet, it's the third or fourth biggest city in the country. The joke is that it's now Seoul-shi Daegu, which is a joke you might not get if you're not a Korean speaker, but I assure you it's very funny and telling in any case, if more so than funny, that now we're now a district of Seoul effectively, because you can commute. I've known people who have done the Daegu-Seoul commute. It's not easy, but it's possible. But for some parts of the country, there may be no alternative but to hook up to the capital as best as possible.
Right, so all roads need to lead to Seoul.
Indeed, indeed.
Kelly, moving forward, one German media outlet recently applauded South Korea's adoption of an AI-based call service for regular checks on senior citizens living by themselves. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular service, and what are the prospects of having this being adopted by countries overseas, do you think?
Yeah, I think right now we're having a global conversation about AI, and it's coming from a very fear-based place. And so when journalists see potentially positive examples of AI applications, especially in kind of a humanitarian context, it tends to get a lot of media coverage, and so this is one potential example of that. My understanding is that there was a pilot program that is now being adopted a little bit on a greater scale by cities in Seoul, where essentially people of a certain elderly age demographic are targeted by robocalls, and they are hit with a questionnaire, basically like, have you exercised today? Have you hydrated? How are you feeling? And then if they are to say certain keywords that the machine learning, or whatever you want to call it, is able to pick up on, like stress, that person can then be forwarded to an employed operator and dealt with from there. And from what I've read, it sounds like there have been successful examples of this, so I don't want to knock it. I think for me, it's interesting and indicative of the times that we are living in, where we have a very elderly population that is highly neglected, where social work is not a well-compensated or highly sought-after profession, or there simply just aren't enough social workers. And this isn't just a Korea issue. This is an issue everywhere, or it's prohibitively expensive. And so you have people who are extremely lonely, who may have no surviving family members checking in on them. And so now we're trying to use computers, basically, to do that. I think there are limitations there. I mean, human connection is a very fundamental need. There's research out there that shows that loneliness is actually more of a health risk to people in terms of mortality rate than obesity or smoking. So I don't think this can replace or really fix the social issue we're seeing all around the world. But if it were, for instance, able to forward someone to a resource that they wouldn't have thought to access themselves otherwise, or if there's a way to make this like a life alert system where if someone's not responding again and again and again, maybe a wellness check is ordered by, you know, like the ambulance or the police, that might be helpful. But it's also something that is based on voluntary participation, right? And I don't know what it's like to be 85 and living alone. Maybe I would respond to a survey like that. And we do see that older people are more likely to answer like electronic polling and things like that. But I certainly hang up the second that I get a robocall, right? And I think some of these programs are also targeting middle-aged people who are single as well to check on them. So I'm a little skeptical. With that said, apparently, according to the articles I've read, there's been some success there. I think it's a Band-Aid solution, quite frankly, to what is a chronic social issue in many parts of the world.
Right, loneliness especially. Right, Colin, staying with German media though, according to RND, and literally in English, that's Editors Network Germany, Capital Seoul, it ranked #1 for solo travelers worldwide. As a resident here, what are your thoughts regarding this ranking?
It's an intriguing list. The first place I ever solo traveled to in my life, Osaka, Japan, was #5. #2 is Kathmandu, Nepal. Intriguing, gonna have to look into that one. #1 is Seoul, as you say. And intriguingly, or sort of coincidentally, after this broadcast, I'm going straight to meet up with a friend who is solo traveling here. His whole thing is solo traveling. His name is Chris Arnadi. He writes a website called Walking the World. He does just that. He's American. He lives in America, but he's always traveling to places in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, all over the place. And he just walks 20 miles a day, all day long, around different cities and writes about his experiences and posts photographs. And he was posting just on arriving here. It's like, oh, I love it. I'm in Seoul again. I get off the plane, I get on this spotless train to come into the city center, and I'm there before I know it. I go to my favorite LP bar, and the streets are, if not clean, then at least like navigable. The public spaces are not trashed. The streets don't feel menacing, certainly. Things work in a way that they don't in many parts of the world, but even in the United States of America, which he writes about U.S. cities as well and complains about their dysfunctionality. And so Chris, he just cannot get enough of exploring Seoul solo, which is what he does. But also, I mean, even if you're not a hardcore solo traveler like he is, you meet people who they could be young people, older people, men, women. In my experience, when I meet them, they always have a good time in Seoul because though there is a higher language barrier than many places, if you don't speak Korean, they sort of work it out. And it feels a little more exotic to them as a result, but it's both like, oh, this place is different, but it's also very, very functional. I can also navigate it. I feel like I can go wherever I want, experience what I want to experience. And it's frictionless in a certain way that they don't expect. So I can understand why Seoul would rank high for solo travelers. And it has to do with a lot of elements that give it a high quality of life even when you live here. You know, it's when I'm traveling solo or otherwise, nice to have a cafe to go to. And it's even nicer to live in Seoul amid all these cafes, but that may just be a personal preference.
Right, and while Seoul remains really popular, Kelly, the concern though is, why do you suppose most travelers, foreign travelers to South Korea, remain within Seoul and do not really bother to travel beyond the borders of the capital city?
Yeah, so my response is going to be based on my observations, not hard research.
For sure.
But I think it's a few things. I think when you think Korea, you think Seoul often if you're a Western foreigner, which makes sense. About half of the country lives in Greater Seoul. As we've discussed today, it's a highly centralized representation of what South Korea is. I think Seoul is more likely to have a high saturation of English speakers, which for tourists is very helpful. Seoul is absolutely massive and sprawling. Almost every single American I have ever taken to Namsan Tower or Lotte Tower has remarked at how unbelievably sprawling Seoul is and how they've seen nothing like it, even if they've seen New York or Chicago or other mega cities. I mean, I'm from Boston, which is considered a major city in the United States. It has like 600,000 to 1 million people in Boston proper. That's a joke when you compare it to the population and just the sprawling size of Seoul. So if you're not coming here for an extended period of time, Seoul might satisfy all of your needs. The other thing is, as much as Korean people really enjoy nature, I don't know if Korea has really done that effective of a job of marketing other parts of Korea that are not Seoul and Busan, and really differentiating it. Why would you go to Jeju Island instead of the Philippines or Krabi, Phuket, Da Nang? Like that's a question that I think the government and the tourism department would really need to answer to get people outside of Seoul. I think a lot of times people are willing to at least leave for Busan because they see it as a city with an ocean, essentially. But really a lot of the Korean cultural identity from an outside perspective is pegged to Seoul. The other thing that I would like to mention is that Korea is still very insular in terms of its infrastructure, in the sense that if you are not here with a Korean phone number or a Korean credit card, it's actually quite a nuisance to travel. There was the Internet Explorer issue that existed up until very recently, where it's if you weren't using an old beat-up PC, good luck even booking a train ticket half the time. And it's still kind of like that. The KTX website is very difficult and confusing, often rejects international credit cards. It's very janky, if you will. When I first came here, I couldn't even order a pizza without a local phone number. So I think Korea really needs to make an effort to make itself more universally convenient travel-wise. It's known for its technology and its convenient lifestyle, but it's not necessarily convenient for an outsider who's just coming in and out of the country.
So who has no mobile phone here or a credit card that is accepted by local businesses then?
Right. That's very different for that.
Something for the government to think about then. Right, we have time for one more question, Colin. We're going to end on a rather solemn note then. The suicide of a young actress here in Korea has reignited talk about internet culture in the country. For those who may not have been following that particular news, tell us a bit about it and also your thoughts about Korea's online social interactions.
Yes, Kim Se-ron was her name, and that might not be a name you know if you haven't followed Korean popular culture, but she was quite famous. She was a child actress. Got, I think, big around 2009, or she first started then in a movie called Yohengja, or A Brand New Life, I think it was. After that, she really blew up in 2010 in the highest grossing film in Korea that year, Ajoshi, or The Man from Nowhere, I think in English it was. She was playing a sort of 10-year-old girl role as she was. And in the US, this is kind of a tale as old as time, the child actor who is successful, maybe too successful, and life goes awry at some point. And for Kim Se-ron, it did in this way. She was getting more and more successful until about 2022, when she got involved in a drunk driving incident where she crashed in Gangnam into an electrical transformer and shut off the power to about 30 or 40 buildings, and she didn't, no one was hurt, no one was injured. I don't think she was seriously hurt in it, but in any case, there was a big backlash and she had to publicly apologize, as celebrities are often made to do here, and even then it's not enough. And she was hounded after that. She, I think, had a birthday party at a bar and sort of, oh, what's she doing? She was arrested driving drunk, and now she's out there having a birthday party with alcohol. And eventually, you know, she couldn't get work, it seemed like, and she would complain about that publicly, and that just drew more fire. And so the Korean aspect here, you could say, is this, the degree of sort of ferocity of the media, or the paparazzi, if you like, and then the commenters that the media tend to stir up, whose anger they tend to rouse. And so in some sense, this is a universal story. As I say, you know, in the US, I remember Macaulay Culkin, an actor of my generation. I was always thinking, well, this guy's going to be found dead in a hotel room one day. But actually, he turned around, and he's back in popular culture, and he says, you know, I was headed down that troubled path, but now I'm a family man, and now everything's great. So it's not always like that. But I think you add child stardom on top of, as you allude to, Korea's online bullying culture, and the fact that there is a certain acceptance, I hate to say it, of suicide here, like, 어쩔 수 없지. There was no other alternative. Whereas in the US, I'm not saying the US is better in this regard, but the sense is suicide is never the answer, to use the cliche. And in a way, that's a good thing. That cliche sort of prevents some deaths that would have happened otherwise. And here, there may be a little bit of complacency about having no alternatives, but maybe you really do feel like you don't in that position.
All right, but hopefully it starts a new debate on the need to better protect people here in the country, especially the young people. All right, then, Colin, thank you so much for your thoughts today. And Kelly, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's editions of Press Perspective. Do have a great weekend, and be sure to join us again same time next Monday.